What's the real story behind this most recent revolution in Egypt? Looking at it on the surface from the viewpoint being handed to us by the mainstream media, it's hard to make out a clear picture, especially since much of the information that we're being given seems contradictory. There's some key evidence that's being obscured by the official line. Once you see that evidence and connect the dots, it all makes perfect sense. And that's what we're going to do in this video. Now, the variable that must be looked at first and foremost if you want to understand the events unfolding in Egypt is the geopolitical importance of the region, especially in relation to oil. Egypt is the home of both the Suez Canal and the Sumed Petroleum Pipeline. 7.5% of world sea trade passes through the Suez Canal. About 20% of this traffic is oil tankers, and 6% is natural gas. The Sumed Pipeline carries approximately 2.4 million barrels of oil a day. As of 1955, two-thirds of Europe's oil passed through Egypt. More recent figures are not readily available, but they may in fact be higher. The Suez Canal and the Sumed Pipeline are listed as World Oil Transit Choke Points on the U.S. Energy and Information Administration website, EIA.gov. The Strait of Hormuz, which is controlled by Iran, is also listed. Make a mental note of that because it's a very important variable in this equation. Collectively, the Suez Canal and the Sumed Pipeline are the only two direct routes for transporting crude oil from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. If ships were unable to navigate through the Suez Canal, or if the Sumed Pipeline were closed, oil tankers would have to be diverted around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 6,000 miles to transit, increasing both cost and shipping time dramatically. According to the International Energy Agency, shipping around Africa would add 15 days of transit to Europe and 8 to 10 days to the United States. This would translate directly into higher oil prices. This was demonstrated clearly as oil prices rose above $100 a barrel in July due to fears that unrest in Egypt would interrupt supply. Whoever controls Egypt controls these choke points. And because of this, the country has been the subject of numerous power games and intrigues over the past century. One of the most notable of which was the Suez Crisis of 1956, in which France, Britain, and Israel initiated a war with Egypt after Egypt nationalized its canal. This crisis, also known as the Tripartite Aggression, started when the Israelis invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, forcing Egypt to defend itself. The English and the French then declared the resultant fighting a threat to the canal, so they entered the war on Israel's side. This strategy, which came to be called the Protocole de Sèvres, had been pre-planned and agreed upon in discussions between the three countries and France earlier that year. We are taught in schools that the age of colonialism ended sometime in the early 1900s, but this really isn't true. Colonialism is still very much alive and well. It's just taken a new form. What we have today is covert colonialism. The United States and its allies have become very adept at toppling governments that are not cooperative and installing puppets to do their bidding. The first documented example of this was the U.S. and British-backed coup of 1953, which removed the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power in Iran after he nationalized Iran's oil fields and installed the Shah in his place. The Shah, of course, promptly let the U.S. and British oil companies back in. Just one little problem. The Shah was a dictator, and he was very unpopular. The Iranian people don't really like being ruled by puppets, so they overthrew the Shah in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution. The government that replaced him has this crazy idea that Iranians should run Iran, and that the U.S. should mind its own business. Of course, for Washington, this is unacceptable, especially since approximately 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran itself is sitting on the world's third largest oil reserves. The United States has been trying to find a way to get a regime change in Iran for some time now. For many years, the focus has been on building up a trumped-up case against Iran's nuclear energy program, claiming that they're working on building a bomb. This hasn't gotten much traction internationally or domestically, largely due to the fact that the U.S. government no longer has any credibility on these types of issues. You can only cry wolf about weapons of mass destruction so many times before people start to roll their eyes. Furthermore, both the CIA and Mossad have come forward stating that Iran hasn't even made the decision to build a nuclear weapon, much less start. So Washington was forced to take a more indirect route to get to Iran, and that indirect route is through Syria. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and the two countries have a mutual defense agreement. So if the United States can find an excuse to enter Syria, it'll draw in Iran, and then they'll have their excuse for their war. This isn't just theoretical. The United States has been arming the Syrian rebels covertly for some time now, and recently they began arming them openly. Iran is responding by sending troops to Syria. Russia and China have taken Syria's side. Now, believe it or not, this crisis in Syria relates directly to the situation in Egypt, but in order to see how, we have to take a step back. Hosni Mubarak, former president of Egypt, was widely viewed as an American puppet. He had assisted the U.S. in the Gulf War of 1991, and in return, America, the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, and Europe forgave Egypt about $20 billion of debt. This perception that Mubarak's regime was under American control was reinforced by the fact that while he was in power, Egypt was the second largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, Israel being the largest recipient, of course. Though Mubarak had protected U.S. interests for many years, in the final decade of his rule he began to push back on several key issues. Among these were his refusal to send troops to Iraq to assist in the 2003 invasion, and his rejection of the U.S. nuclear weapons umbrella for Egypt in 2009. The U.S. doesn't like it when their puppets push back, so they began covertly funding opposition groups to take Mubarak out of office. This effort culminated in the uprising of 2011. This doesn't mean that the uprising or the emotion driving it was fake. The Egyptian people were genuinely angry. Their discontent was real. The United States just channeled that anger to get the regime change that they desired. This would seem like a risky maneuver for the U.S., to take down a somewhat cooperative regime and leave the replacement up to chance. However, the simple fact of the matter is that it wasn't really left up to chance. The Egyptian people weren't in charge of the transition after Mubarak fell. The military was. And the military, with Hussein Tantawi, commonly referred to as Mubarak's poodle, put their support behind Mohamed Morsi, who was in reality just an American puppet of another flavor. Many people were fooled by this political sleight of hand because they believed that Mubarak was the root of the problem, and the illusion of change temporarily eased the public's discontent. This technique isn't new or novel in any way. In fact, it's the standard mechanism of control in so-called Western democracies. New puppets are ushered in periodically through elections, while the real ruling class remains thoroughly entrenched. That's the benefit of using a figurehead. They're disposable. Now, Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood may have had their own agenda. They had their own reasons for seeking power. But the price they paid for their installment was their pledge of support for the U.S. campaign against Syria. The Egyptian people, however, began to catch on quickly. They didn't particularly want their country to be a vassal of the United States, nor did they like the direction that Morsi was taking Egypt domestically. So they rose up and they took to the streets in record numbers. The protests in July of 2013 were the largest in recorded history. 30 million people showed up. This number was especially astounding because Egypt only has a population of 82 million. This was a true popular uprising, and it was fully capable of toppling the Morsi regime by itself without the assistance of the military. However, if that had happened, the outcome would have been unpredictable, and Washington would have lost all leverage in the situation. The only way to avoid this was to have the military intervene preemptively and remove Morsi from power. By doing so, the military was once again in position to control the transition, and therefore influence the replacement. None of this really makes sense until you account for one crucial variable in the equation. While the puppets that are presented to the public as leaders are replaceable, the real source of Washington's influence is positioned within the Egyptian military. And the military hasn't lost any power in this crisis. In fact, it's strengthened this position. The military's move against Morsi was widely interpreted as a sign that they were allied with the people. Everyone seems to have forgotten that it was the military that put Morsi in power in the first place. He was their pick. And now the military has a new pick, El-Baradei. Just last week, Reuters quoted a source close to the Egyptian military high command as saying that El-Baradei was their first choice. And sure enough, El-Baradei was put forward as one of the top candidates to lead the interim government. In the end, he secured the role as vice president, even though his nomination was temporarily put into doubt due to rumors that he may be Washington's pick for the job. Now, of course, El-Baradei's supporters are doing their best to deny his connections to Western powers, but his resume speaks for itself. El-Baradei served on the board of trustees for the International Crisis Group. This page has since been removed from the Crisis Group website, most likely because a lot of people were linking to it as evidence. George Soros sits on the executive committee of the International Crisis Group, alongside Council on Foreign Relations member Morton Abramowitz, and Zbigniew Brzezinski is listed as a senior advisor. That should tell you something about the organization right there. Furthermore, just this past February, El-Baradei was working actively to get Egypt to accept a large IMF loan, which was of course tied to structural adjustments and austerities. Just his eagerness to bring in the IMF tells us everything we need to know. IMF loans with the strings that they attach are Trojan horses. They're used to bring countries under Western control by saddling them with unpayable debt. For more information on how IMF and World Bank loans are used as weapons, do a Google search for Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Now the details in Egypt are changing by the minute, and it may be that an entirely different puppet is put forth through the elections in the end, one that doesn't have any publicly traceable connections to the US or NATO. But make no mistake, these neo-colonialists will not just stand by and let the Egyptian people choose their own course. The control of the Suez Canal and the Sumed pipeline is too important. Either a new Western puppet will be installed, or there will be more interference, and the situation could degrade into a civil war. One way or another, this drama isn't over. If the Egyptian people don't want another US puppet, the military can't be allowed to run the transition. All remnants of the old regime's leadership in the armed services must be retired from service, and every politician with connections to the US, NATO, or their globalist front groups needs to be removed from the running. This is the only way that the Egyptian people are going to have any chance of self-determination. If you'd like to understand the real stakes of this conflict, please watch The Road to World War III. If this is a message that you feel people need to hear, then please share this video through as many avenues as possible. Post it on Facebook, on Twitter, on your blog, send it to your friends via email. Feel free to download it, put it on disk, translate it, hand it out to people. If you do make a translation, please post it as a video response so that it's easier for people to find. If you'd like more videos like this, subscribe to Storm Clouds Gathering on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/StormCloudsGathering, on Twitter at Collapse Updates. You can find us on Google Plus by doing a search for Storm Clouds Gathering, and of course our website is stormcloudsgathering.com.